Hello and welcome to the Gauntlet podcast. Each month we look back at games played by Gauntlet folks here as part of our online gaming community. My name is Ray and I use he, they pronouns. I'm joined today by my wonderful, lovely co-host, Shane. Shane, how are you doing today?
Good, thanks. I just want to say that I'm recording today from the land of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation and acknowledge their elders past and present. Excited to be on the show today.
Yeah, it's going to be good because today we are joined by Puckett. So Puckett, tell us about yourself.
I use he, him pronouns. I have 2 cats. I have way too many books and too many interests, and I never have enough time. But I really like tabletop role-playing games.
For our first segment of our podcast, each of us gets to go over the RPGs we played around December, January, and we talk in depth about one game we got to play on the Gauntlet calendar. So let's go ahead and start with Shane. How was your gaming in December or January?
Well, December was very quiet for me, but then January, at least by my standards, was quite busy. I feel like in the company of Gauntlet podcast hosts, it may not count as busy, where the standards are much higher. But off Gauntlet, I started a new game of The Between, and I got to play in a Masks one-shot that was really fun. On the Gauntlet in December, I ran Knights Black Agent Solo Ops, which I talked about last month on the podcast. And then in January, I started my quarterly Fate of the Fairy Queen game, which is a reskin of Fate of Cthulhu from Evil Hat Games. That's been really fun. And I ran a little series of horror one-shots. So Bluebeard's Bride, Lovecraft-esque, and Quietus. All of those games were super fun. I recommend them all quite highly. But the one that I'm going to talk about in more detail today is Quietus. What is it? Quietus is a forged-in-the-dark role-playing game of melancholy horror by Ollie Jeffrey, who I think will be listening. Hi, Ollie.
Hi, Ollie.
The touchstones are things like The Babadook, the Netflix series of The Haunting of Hill House, any sort of horror, especially movie, that has a focus on big emotions and, well, often sadness, I guess, is the key emotion in a horror movie. It's designed for one-shot play of about 1 to 2 hours, and I think our game ran for about 2.5 hours, which is a great length for me, for a GM and 1 or 2 players. It has this prepless setup where you don't come necessarily with a scenario, you just run through some setup questions, although the rules do include a section of 13 tragedies that are essentially pre-generated setups that you can use. And the basic framework that all Quietus games share is that the characters are somewhere isolated, something has gone wrong, and someone who should be there with you isn't. And that is such, I think, a rich and generative frame that can go off in so many different directions. So what worked for me? My first and most superficial answer to this is that it was lovely to see so many familiar Gauntlet folks' names in the examples of play in the game text. It clearly was play tested at the Gauntlet quite a lot. I always start a game by asking the players, have you played this before? And when I asked Dunner, I knew that the answer was yes because he was all over the game text. One thing that worked for me, and this is a sort of broader reflection, is that I think I've really come around to dice pools as being a good mechanic for suspense games, which is not at all obvious to me that it would work that way. But it does because of the kind of suspense that's almost baked into the mechanical structure, because, you get to this decision point where we've decided that it's exciting to add some uncertainty to the game. You need to do a thing, it's important in some way, and we stop. We talk about it. So here's the first die. Do you get this one? Yeah, you can have that first die. And then we talk about the second die. Do you get this one? We're like building this suspense about what your chance of success is, how much risk you're taking. In many cases, it's too late to back out now if you realize you don't have enough dice, so that's more suspense. It's just interesting to me because intuitively it seems that slowing down like that would tend to diffuse the tension. Some people worry about breaking immersion in a role-playing game, and I think probably most Gauntlet folks don't worry about that so much. But still, it's just been really interesting to me to reflect on the way that you can just load that extra tension into every increment of the game or of the mechanics in that way.
I feel like there's this strong connection between finding mechanics that not only make sense narratively for the game, but also create this meta layer, like what you were talking about just now. Because I know this is based on the Forge in the Dark system. And I remember when I first started working in a political intrigue game, I originally didn't think Forged in the Dark would be a good fit, but because it's also a resource management game, it kind of went along with the same, like, how you feel as a political character. So it's also interesting how much it works well in this horror setting. Super cool.
Yeah. One of the main ways, and basically the best way mechanically to get extra dice for that pool, is to describe an emotionally painful flashback for your character as well, which I love it when the power gaming approach like dovetails with the thematic approach so strongly. It strongly encourages you to just smash yourself brutally into its harder themes. It aims to play like a horror movie, and I think it really does. You know, I think often people throw around the word cinematic about games, but I think this one did have a distinct cinematic quality that I really appreciated. It loads all the sort of slow build parts of that horror movie that we're creating into the introductory sort of question and answer phase, and then our actual play, if I can distinguish it like that, is just the movie's climax, from the point where things start to really go wrong and then just escalate and escalate and escalate dramatically and excitingly and thrillingly until a final moment where you either survive and escape or triumph or you don't. I think that's a really smart decision, just to skip over all the slow stuff. The horror part of a horror game where you actually confront the horror has to be like pretty constrained. In an investigation game, you can always be looking for clues. But in a horror game, you can't just be like face to face with the monstrosity all the time. So horror games always, to me, have this challenge of how do we distract, like what are we going to keep the characters busy doing while we wait to get to the horror? And the classic RPG answer is we'll make them investigate. And sometimes that works well, and sometimes it works less well. One of the reasons that I love Monster Hearts is because I think that it doesn't have to be played as a horror game, but it has the great answer to that question of what do the characters do when not confronting the horror. And Monster Hearts says they're just dicks to each other and flirt and try and have sex, which is, in my opinion, a vastly better answer than they look for clues.
That, but I was still surprised. Like, it's true.
But this game just says, no, we just go straight to the horror, which of course is another fantastic answer. I think it works really well. What I've said might make this sound like a play-to-lose game, but it has a really finely balanced mechanic that lets you keep hope alive and aims to bring everything down to a climactic final dice roll where there's still a chance that you'll succeed and triumph, and there's still a chance that everything will go horribly wrong. Well, everything will go horribly wrong, but you might still triumph anyway, I guess is how I'd put it. Things I'm less sure about. When we played, Michael maxed out his anxiety track very quickly. I didn't really talk about this mechanic, but it really limited his options for ways that he could build his dice pool, and it meant that we did lose out on some more flashbacks to flesh out his character more. So that's definitely something, if I was playing again, I would take more time to talk about and sort of figure out and flesh out at the start so people are clear about those decisions. We played a very straightforward slasher type story as well, although on an airplane, which was a bit of an exciting difference.
Ooh.
And I did wonder how it would work, whether it would work as well for sort of weirder types of horror. When you tell me it's a game about emotional horror, I immediately think of Hereditary, and I just want this traumatic family drama with ghosts and Satanism. So I'd really like to try that out. I'm excited to see if it does work well, or for folk horror, or some... Obviously, you can hear that I am keen to play this game many more times, and I'm keen to try it out in as many different approaches and subgenres as I can. And I also found myself wondering how well it would work, and, you know, how cruelly I would be betraying the central, like, beauty and design brilliance of this game to just rip out the emotional part and play it as a full-out, like, brutal slasher simulator like Friday the 13th game, with no emotions, just dead teenagers.
That line is so good. No emotions, just dead teenagers. I just love that.
So, my takeaway... I just had such a good time. I couldn't get over how great this game is. Might be ridiculous to call my game of the year in January, but if we get to December and I'm not talking about this game, can you just remind me, Shane, don't forget Quietus, but I do not
Don't forget how much you loved it, right?
My other takeaway, like we talked about Forged in the Dark, and I think this is a pretty stripped down version of those rules, but it did make me even more excited to try out more Forged in the Dark games, which is one of my gaming goals for this year. So that's basically what I have to say about Quietus. Try it, it's so good.
Okay, I really gotta try this game.
You really should. It's amazing.
All right, so Puckett, how about yourself? How was your gaming recently?
Like Shane, my December was kind of slow. I'm trying to remember how many games I had in December, and I think I was running most of them. But I found time to squeeze in some games. Played Tachyon Squadron and iHunt. Shane, you remember the iHunt sessions. Christian Star from Lipsticks. That would be capital L-Y-P, capital S-T-Y-X-X. Hair metal guitarist. It's a complete doofus. I played Delta Green, This Night on the Rooftops. Stephen ran an amazing session of that, and I really loved the way that we were able to just play. Like, we were all grown adults in a Google Drawing file, and we were just putting shapes around and labels and things like, here's where the frogs live in this steamboat that we've somehow managed to hoist into this magical tree. It was quite an experience. Passions of the Peaks. Jesse has been trying to run Twin Peaks in Pasión de las Pasiones. It worked pretty well. I liked a lot about it. Against the Dark Conspiracy. Played Delta Green. And Our Family at Home Abroad, which is a game that Dan Brown has been playtesting. So that's pretty much been the ones that I've played so far in the last couple of months or so. It's not a coincidence that 2 of the games that I was in were either hacks of or versions of Pasión de las Pasiones. And that's what I wanted to talk about was Dan's Our Family at Home Abroad, which is based on the fish out of water stories that you might be familiar with from Northern Exposure. His touch point was, I think it's called The Durrells in Corfu. It was a PBS show that ran. It's mostly about people coming from a culture, trying to get away from that culture, and finding themselves immersed in a completely different culture that they don't necessarily understand. So, there's faux pas, there's embarrassment, there's chagrin, there's realizing that you might be in it up to your neck. You may not be understanding why people do some of the things that they do. We wound up with a family that had emigrated from Germany and moved to Alaska. And a lot of what we were dealing with was, hey, we're in this tiny town in Alaska. There's maybe 1 or 2 other people even remotely close to our age here. We are completely removed from the culture that we know. And we realized kind of early on that it can get kind of thorny. It could quickly turn into something problematic. I mean, especially if you're going into a culture that you don't necessarily know anything about, which is kind of why we just settled on a community of German-ish settlers, which is why we wound up there. But it was far enough removed that the German-esque stuff that we saw there was about as German as going to a hot dog stand in Chicago and getting yourself a brat. I mean, it can be authentic-ish, but you're not getting a real German brat necessarily. One of the things that I loved about it, that I absolutely loved about it, is that it was small stakes game. People weren't going to die. They might feel like they were going to die of embarrassment, but they weren't going to literally die. It's just, oh, here's a local custom that you're not aware of. You've managed to put your foot in your mouth. I mean, I think we can all identify with that. One of the things that I really appreciated about it is that it heavily emphasizes players taking on the role of members of a family. You might be one of the parents, you might be a child. There's a playbook which allows you to play somebody else in the town. We wound up with 1 person playing somebody from the town and 3 of us playing members of the family. And we were able to tell these kind of heartwarming stories in a way. I mean, the older teen kind of sulked everywhere and spoil sport like a sourpuss, grumped around everywhere like, I don't understand why I have to do this. Why do we even have to be here? Marley played the middle teen who loved being an artist, and I played the youngest who just absolutely loved whales. And one of the things that came up in it was this little story about going out on a whaling boat. And I was looking for whales, and the middle child was talking to all the sailors on this boat about their tattoos. And sure enough, Chekhov's gun. Somebody's interested in tattoos, somebody's interested in whales, you're kids, you gotta do something foolish. final session, there I am getting a stick and poke tattoo from my sister, who's 2 years older than I am, as we are trying to figure all this out. It's that sort of small stakes where it's not going to determine whether anybody lives or dies, but it allows you to really get deep into the relationships between family members, between a family and the community that they are moving into or that they're trying to integrate with. One of the things that interested me about it was Passiones is typically a game about running off and behaving recklessly. If you are thinking about what you're doing in Passiones, you're probably not playing it right. If something isn't exploding, if you aren't trying to seduce someone, what are you doing?
Right. 100%.
In this game, a lot more of it was about reacting. So you're running into unfamiliar customs or behaviors, and it's how do you react to this situation? It's not as much what do you do in this situation? Like, here's this unfamiliar thing. Do you punch the person doing it, or do you run away and faint? It was more like, do you feel awkward about this? Do you feel uncomfortable by this? How is this making you feel? So it was much more reactive as opposed to proactive. It was interesting to me because it felt like coming at Passiones from a different angle. And it wasn't an angle I was familiar with. And honestly, I struggled with it a little bit because I'm used to going in someplace, doing something foolish, and then dealing with the explosive consequences that typically result. And this very much wasn't that. So it took a while for me to get used to it. So yeah, there was a lot that I really, really liked about it. I'm excited to see where Dan takes this. And let's be blunt, game designers all know this. There's times you're doing things and they just sing and they work and you can get them done almost like you're breathing. And then there's times that things sometimes fall by the wayside. And I hope that this is not something that falls by the wayside. I'd really like to see what happens with it and where it goes.
That's such an interesting thing about a game being more reactive. Mm-hmm. And when I was also experimenting with designing a PBTA game, it's designing triggers is like really, really interesting. Mm-hmm. And it really shifts between games and designers in a really interesting way.
Yeah.
Puckett, hearing you talk about this game, I can't help but think like, because when I think like fish out of water, mm-hmm. I can't help but also think like fresh off the boat. Like it's a very immigrant story, right? Mm-hmm. And I can't help but, I haven't seen the game, but I can't help but think like a white person going to a new place is not the same as a person of color going to a new place. I can't help but kind of wonder about that. But yeah, I mean, it still sounds super interesting though.
I really enjoyed it.
I defer to you, Puckett, because you have undoubtedly played vastly more Passiones than I have. But my experience is that it's much less common for people to roll misses. Mm-hmm. Because of the way moves are structured, you don't have negative stats to roll with or anything like that. Mm-hmm. So misses are less common, even mixed results are less common. It's more common to get successes. And Passiones makes that work by making just all the moves like their own disaster if you succeed. Mm-hmm. The drama of success is almost worse for your character than the drama of a miss. So I think that is challenging to bring to a context where you might rely more on misses or you wanted things to be a bit smaller scale.
Yeah. And it was very interesting because it upends Passiones in a way. I mean, Passiones is about cranking up the drama and the mayhem and the chaos. It's a telenovela. It's a soap opera. If you don't have the amps turned to 11, are you even trying? And this was much more like turning the amps off and playing an acoustic guitar. Almost.
Oh, yeah. So interesting. All right, so in terms of the gaming that I got to do around December, January, so in the time-honored tradition of slowing down around December, it's true I didn't get to play as much, but off the gauntlet, we have our Blades in the Dark campaign still going on, which is a lot of fun. I have 2 cultists, and I'm the GM. It's really great. And we just started a Godbound campaign, so this is going to be my first real dive into OSR, which has been really, really interesting. And on the Gauntlet, I got to play Hearts of Wulin, one of my favorite games. And people are getting their physical copies of the game, so definitely worth checking out Hearts of Wulin. And I also, because I am perpetually designing, I did a couple of playtests for Voidwalkers, which is my space opera powered by the Apocalypse game, and the Twilight Throne, which is my Forged in the Dark political intrigue game. So that's been a lot of fun. But I also got to play Heart, the City Beneath, which is the game that I want to talk about today. So Heart, the City Beneath is a game by Grant Howitt and Christopher Taylor. This is from the same publisher, Rowan Rucken-Deckard of the Spire games. In fact, Heart, the City Beneath is connected to Spire. Literally, it's below the city, so that's very cool. And Heart, the City Beneath is a delve into a nightmare undercity. It is a dungeon-crawling, story-forward tabletop RPG from the designers of Spire, and focuses on what characters have to lose in pursuit of their dreams in the chaotic darkness beneath the world. It uses the resistance system, which has been updated specifically for Heart. So that was one of the main reasons I wanted to try out the game, because I heard it updated the resistance system and I wanted to see how it was different. And I was really excited to try that out. So what worked for me in terms of Heart is, like Spire, this game has a great setting. Both Spire is more like, what if Eberron, but darker, right? It's got this like dungeon punk, but there's also like a weird, magical, bizarre vibe to it. And in Heart, they kind of like cranked all that up to 11. They did not hold back with Heart, which made it really easy for me to run, because Eberron was my favorite D&D setting. I really, really love the Spire setting so much. And in Heart, it is more of the same. And as a GM, I tend to gravitate towards bringing up body horror or dark humor a lot very easily in my games. And so Heart lends itself to that. It was very easy for me to run in that regard. Also, so as you like explore the city beneath, the book provides you landmarks that you can draw inspiration from, though the book does specify that everyone's heart is going to be a little different. And so mine was definitely more into the creepy, bizarre, cosmic body horror side. But lots of great landmarks to choose from. I had so much fun drawing inspiration from the rich details that were provided, and then just going absolutely wild with it, just like leaping off from the platform the setting provided. And so Spire and now Heart are both deeply imaginative settings that are unique, beautiful, scary, weird, and darkly funny. There's a group of box signal cultists, and I had to look up what a box signal was. It's like this, like there were these videos on YouTube of British people talking for like an hour about what is essentially like a way to signal to the trains to make sure they're on the right track. I'm just really amazed at how British people can like really talk about a very specific like a mundane thing with so much love. But anyway, so, and from there birth cultists in this game, which is really funny. And another thing I loved is the classes are so great. In Spire, I already loved the classes, but in Heart, they really like in that continuing vibe of amping it up to 11. So for example, there's the Deep Apiarist, which is a person who has been mostly replaced by bees. And I'm not going to go into too much into it. It's very body horror, like built into the class, but it's so cool. So it's a more reflective, insightful, the skill monkey type that we like to talk about class. But it's so interesting to have it revolve around having bees as part of your body now, which is really cool. I also love the Vermissian Knight. It's so great in the setting. There's this entire, like, they try to build train stations and trains in Spire, and things went horribly wrong in the most awful way possible, in the most like dimensional tearing way possible. And so you can play a class, a Vermissian Knight, because the train line was called the Vermissian, that never got to be made, and your armor is literally made out of train parts. It's very cool, and it further supports the setting. So the most important mechanic well, in my mind, other people may disagree with me here, is that the resistance system is built on Fallout. The idea that as you rack up more stress, it will turn into Fallout at some point, which is like horrible things that your character has to go through. Heart is really great for folks who like to play to lose. My players were so excited every time they had to deal with Fallout. Though I do apologize to Sherry, because Sherry was one of our players and Sherry loves helping people, and I specifically gave her the Fallout where she cannot help people. So but the fact that there was a Fallout that covered that was really, really great. Another thing that I loved is, and this is something that people in the Gauntlet brought up when I asked about playing Heart, are the beats. So very cool. Heart beats, you get it, right? Very awesome. Basically, beats work like Stars and Wishes. Stars and Wishes is a tool that we use a lot on the Gauntlet, where at the end of every session, you talk about the stars, the things that you like that happen in the session, and you talk about wishes, things that you're hoping will happen for you or the series in the next session. And this is kind of built into Heart, in that you can choose beats that are associated with your class, things that you want to happen. And once you hit those beats, that's when you take an advancement, which is really cool. So every time you fulfill a minor beat, you get a minor advancement. Every time you fulfill a major beat, you get a major advancement. And there are also zenith beats. And so when you get a zenith advancement, this is the one awesome ability that will probably spell the horrific doom for your character, or something worse. Sometimes they're much worse things than dying, and that happens a lot in Heart. So it's really great. It's super, super fun. So I really love Heart, but what I'm less sure about, there's also a lot I don't like about Heart. I want to preface this by saying that a lot of folks in the Gauntlet love this game as it is. So even if I'm not one of them, I just wanted to put that out there. So you may still love this game so much, even if I have some pretty significant misgivings. But this is true for all games. We all have different tastes and what works for us in our tables. So I still recommend checking out Heart if you haven't. But yeah, so the things that I'm not sure about is the game claims it's story-driven. Like, much of the GM advice is built on the assumption that you were running a story game, right? So that's what I was preparing myself for mentally, that, okay, this is a story game. In fact, there are sections like, if you've run a story game before, you can skip over this. I still read it because I'm a Capricorn who over-prepares, but I read it going like, oh yeah, I am familiar with this stuff. But when we actually played the game, a lot of the mechanics don't support story that naturally comes up. It felt like it even got in the way of the story. When I was running Heart, it really felt like I was running D&D. I was getting flashbacks. At one point, I was like, there are two GMs inside me. One that ran D&D a lot, and one that's only been running story games for the last how many years, and they are fighting with each other. Like, I really felt like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde just like splitting in the middle. So when I say like running D&D, for me, what my experience was in all those years I did is that the setting and the GM had to do most of the heavy lifting for the story to happen, unlike how a story game will generate narrative beats naturally. The thing is, I've always been an intuitive GM, so I just basically low-key suffered the whole time I was running D&D, because it's not really a game you can run intuitively. But I made myself do it, and I suffered. But yeah, so usually I draw upon a story game's mechanics, from the playbooks to task resolutions. And so to create a compelling narrative, that's what I usually do. But I couldn't do that with Heart. Like, I kept stopping and I kept struggling to like pull on the story. And I found myself reverting to that D&D brain to create that story. It was so jarring. It was so jarring. I was really like, what is going on? An example of the mechanics that get in the way of the story, for me, was the resistance system itself, the main way of task resolution. Number one, it's a lot of rolling. So first you have to roll to see if the action succeeds. Then most likely you're going to take stress based on the results. And then you roll to see how much stress you take. And then I have to, as a GM, roll to see if you take fallout, comparing it to a number. So that's like about 3 rolls for like one action. And something has to happen at the end of each roll, but it's not always like connected in a way that makes sense narratively, even though it's supposed to. As a GM, I also have to think about, okay, there are 5 resistance tracks, so which one is going to take stress here? Which one is on the line as a stake when they make an action? And then some of those fallouts are kind of similar to each other, like Mind and Echo are very similar. I kept struggling between those two. And then once they do get fallout, I have to look at a list and then think about which fallout the person is going to take. And then after they take the fallout, I had to keep it in mind because it can affect other it was just a lot. It was like a lot to keep track of. And so I've played Spire several times, and the mechanics never sunk in or became intuitive. I just always had a problem with the resistance system. And so I was hoping it would be different for Heart because they did update the system, but I still had the same problem. We played for 4 sessions, and I never felt like it felt natural for any of us. Like, we all kept referring to the rules over and over again. So once again, I'm going to say this might be different for other people's tables. I had a lot of people who loved the resistance system. I unfortunately am not one of them, but yes. My takeaway, though, is despite all of what I said, I still want to play Heart again because ultimately we had a really fun time despite the system. But the setting is so good. The setting was a lot of fun. The body horror, dark humor stuff was just really on point. 4 sessions felt way too short. We only got to do like 1 delve, explore 1 landmark. So I'd love to have more sessions. Plus, we were still learning the game at the same time. So we might be able to do more when we come back to it. But when we come back, I will definitely find ways to streamline the resistance system and make it more fun. I've seen some indie designers like doing that where they sort of streamline things. So I'm going to look at what other designers have done. And maybe incorporate that. But yeah, that was my time playing Heart, the City Beneath.
Hi listeners, I wanted to let you know that new issues of Codex are now available in the Gauntlet Patreon feed. Codex is the Gauntlet's bi-monthly role-playing game magazine. Each issue is organized around a theme and stuffed with brand new material for your table, including original games and supplemental material for games like Trophy and Brindlewood Bay. Check out Codex by going to patreon.com/gauntlet. Your pledge not only gets you Codex and other Gauntlet publications, but it also supports all the important work we do in the Gauntlet, including this very podcast. If you'd like to try before you buy, there's always a free issue of Codex available on our website, gauntlet-rpg.com. And if you're looking for back issues, you can find them on DriveThruRPG, including in reduced price bundles. Thanks.
In our second segment, Puckett is going to talk about a topic of his choice. So, Puckett, I think we might already have a feeling, because it came up a few times, but what would you like to talk about today?
Why not talk about Passion de las Pasiones? I kind of feel like a one-trick pony right now, but I also feel like it's a really good trick.
It's an amazing trick.
It's really interesting to me how solid I hesitate to call it an ashcan. I much prefer the euphemism that somebody else came up with a while back, playtest materials. But it says a lot about the ashcan of Passiones that I've been running games with it for 2.5 years, 3 years, I think. And I know people were running games with it before I was. So it's not like I'm sitting here saying that I was first on the spot or anything of the sort. My introduction to Passiones came through Lowell, and it grabbed me in a way that only a few games have, which is kind of strange to me because beyond my grandmother watching soap operas, I didn't really have a lot of connection to telenovelas. Yet here I am, and this game is just grabbing my imagination and won't let go. Brandon Leon Gambetta says on Twitter from time to time that it's not that he has an issue with other games, it's just that he thinks that Passiones can run them. And that is something that I have gone out of my way to put to the test. Shane, you have done some of that testing yourself. As I think I mentioned previously, Shane ran Delta Green in Passiones. It worked. I ran Borderlands in Passiones.
I was dying to play the Borderlands Passiones version.
It was wild. That's when I learned that Jim likes to go for Meltdown as quickly as possible. So was actually really amazed at how well the 6 original playbooks translated over to Borderlands. Then, just to see if I could really, really push it to the limit and see if I could break it, I ran SpongeBob SquarePants in it.
Okay, I missed that one. I totally missed the SpongeBob one.
It worked. I have run Westerns in it. I have run science fiction games in it. I have run slice of life games in it. I have run... For Halloween in 2020, I got the bright idea that I wanted to run a Dark Shadows-esque gothic soap opera. And it worked fine. And then the players wanted to keep going. So a couple months later, we got back together and we did another series. And then it was about a month later or so, we did another series. And we basically ran about every other month until we finished up at the end of January. And that involved hacking some playbooks, hacking some questions, morphing things, changing, for example, El Gemelo into the Shapeshifter. We were dealing with characters who had very long lifespans. So it involved researching the history of the area where I set this fictitious city, Ciudad Soñando. I was careful to stress this, and all the players were aware of it, and we dealt with it pretty sensitively. I mean, some of them were near immortal, and they were members of indigenous tribes that were all but wiped out by, Spanish colonization and the actions of the Catholic Church 3.5, 4 centuries ago in Baja California. We dealt with actual events of the time, and it's not real pleasant history. But we wound up with this semi-ongoing series. We just take a month or so off here and there. And we had an archivist who worked for the Town Historical Society. We had an incarnation of La Llorona. We had a ghost hunter who had to sort of die to ensure that ghosts moved on if they were being troublesome. And in the process, kind of lost the ability to die. We had vampires, and it was just... all of these characters were cranked up to 11. So the vampire was a disaster vamp who kept running into the sun. And at some point, the historical preservationist was turned into a vampire and started brooding and basically went full Batman, but vampire, as one does. The thing that most interests me about it is that I don't think of Pasiones as a game. I think of it as a framework for storytelling. I have yet to find a type of story that it cannot handle telling. At the end of 2020, I ran 2 separate series of a fairy tale. From this, I learned a couple of things. 1, Pasiones can run just about anything. 2, don't run the same series twice in a month because you're going to get confused over which series is doing what and which characters belong to whom.
Yeah.
You'd think that would be obvious, but there were people who wanted to play it and they couldn't play it on that night. What the heck, I can throw another series on the calendar. No big deal.
And I can see it being more complicated for Personas because things happen. A lot of things happen per session.
Yeah.
So I'm sure it was hard to keep it.
It was. We basically wound up telling a straight-up fairy tale. There was a snow queen. There were ice palaces. That was one of the stories. The other one focused on this odd little bird, and suddenly all the animals in town could talk. Still, one of the absolute best takes I have ever seen on El Jefe came out of that session, because a person wanted to play El Jefe as a dog who led a pack of stray dogs in the city.
Oh my god, that's amazing, right? Because El Jefe has goons. Oh, yeah, that's so...
It was great. Suddenly, it's like, the switch gets flipped, and, all the adults are going to sleep, and all of a sudden the animals can talk. So the dog can talk. The rats in the city can talk. Every animal can talk. And it led to a completely different story in which they found a bird that needed to be born, in sort of a phoenix story. Every 90 years or so, this bird is born, and this ice queen wants to capture it and chain it to her nefarious purposes, of course. And that's how we wound up with an altar boy barricading the doors of the church with pews and then lighting them on fire after uttering a bunch of one-liners from the St. Crispin's Day speech, just anything dramatic. And that was actually the series that led into the other series that I ran last year that was on more or less ongoing. It was slated to run for the entire year, and with the exception of a few sessions, it did. There were a couple of sessions where, due to exhaustion, whatnot, things like that, it just didn't happen. But a couple of the characters rolled over from that fantastic, magical realist story into this slice of life. You've graduated from high school. Your whole life is in front of you until we get to December. And once we hit that last session in December, your whole life is behind you. So let's go ahead and narrate your end. How do you come to the end of your life here? And every month, I should say most months, there were a couple of months where this didn't happen, but more or less every month we would jump forward a few to several years, and the characters would describe what had happened between sessions. And that was part of the setup for each session at the beginning of the month. And it was just, what do you think happened to them? It's not like you have to roll or anything unless you feel like that would be interesting. There's something that you can see that might be a different take on it. But do you think your character got married? Do you think your character had kids? What do you think happened? And it got wild. And it got convoluted. And one of the best things that I can say about both of those series is that the lore that they established for their respective timelines got bonkers. I learned a lot about the game from running it for that long. There can be this idea that PBTA games can't handle a long campaign. Well, I ran, I think it was 7 months worth of a Weird Passiones game with vampires and witches. I was blessed in that I had an amazing group of players every month, and it changed from month to month. Wound up losing our first player in February because the game started at 2 a.m. in Poland. And he had either been staying up or getting up to play until 5 in the morning. And you understand, like, dropping out. That was just, I'm honestly surprised that you hung in there as long as you did. And then at the end of the series, that also, it kind of fed into a myth in the series, which is if somebody dies, they're going to come back. Because they always came back. Somehow or another, every single person who died in that series came back. But if someone said they were running out to the corner store to get some coffee, they were never going to return. And it was all because of this player who, left for understandable reasons. We all know it. But because of the way StreamYard works, because of the way that backstage area works, that player had emailed me in November to say, hey, would it be okay if I came back? And it's like, absolutely. And so we were actually able to do a shocking return of a character. Ooh. That was also the shocking return of a player.
Right, because you can keep them on the backstage in StreamYard, and then dun-dun-dun-dun,
and nobody notices who's there. And they can hear everything that's going on. They're aware of where the story is, everything that's being said. And then all you have to do is click add to the session, and boom, there it is. I gotta say, that was easily one of the best moments I've had in gaming, because it was just, people were legitimately surprised and shocked and laughing like, wait, what the hell? How did this happen? We didn't even know. I mean, the player and I had been working on figuring out when they were going to be coming back and how to work them in. And, we'd been talking about that for a couple of weeks, but we kept it secret. So it was easily one of my favorite things that I've ever seen in a game. But, the only reason that it hit like it did is because it had been so long. There had been so much storytelling that had gone on in between. There had been so much character growth and character development that entire time. And then, of course, that character came back and was just as big of a dumpster fire as the rest of the characters were, and it all went to hell in a glorious mess. Which is what you expect from a Passiones game. Even if you are running like a high fantasy Passiones game or a Western Passiones game or, fairy tale, doesn't matter. You expect it to go to hell. And when it does, you just hope that it's amazing. So I've learned a lot about not only PBTA, but also the system for Passiones. I've actually been kind of hacking together a lessons learned document for people who might want to try to run a lengthy campaign or a campaign over months, taking months off here and there, the sorts of things that you have to be aware of or watch out for, things that might be helpful. For example, just be ready to handle 2 players with the same playbook. If you are running with a group that is going to change, somebody's going to leave and their playbook's going to be open and somebody else will pick it up. And it may be the case that at some point the other player comes back and that the second player is still there. So great, you've got 2 Ladonias now. What do you do? There's a little bit of negotiation that goes on there, but you'd be surprised at how differently the same playbook in the hands of 2 different players can work, even if they have the same moves. Just the way that they deploy them, the flavor that they bring to each character. Is one of them an Ice Queen? Is the other one a warm-hearted meddler? There's been a lot of little lessons learned like that, and it's stuff that it wouldn't ordinarily pop up in a game, because if you're playing 4 sessions or 8 sessions, you're probably not going to have people dropping out and coming in, and you're probably not going to need to fill that slot because you're going to have more or less the same group. And if you don't, then there's probably not going to be enough time to bring anybody else in. But when you're running for an entire year, slightly different story. It's been a very interesting experience going through these things and watching how players adjust their characters when new players come in. Watching what happens when players decide they need to take a break for a little bit and how they reintegrate with the remaining group when they return. In a lot of cases, it was really heartwarming. And in some cases, it was absolutely heartbreaking. Jose played a character named Paco. And Paco was adopted by a dog who clearly saw that Jose was not going to last long otherwise. And this dog lasted roughly 20 years of the in-game time. And the last scene Jose did, and it just gutted everybody at the table, was the death of Gavi, the dog. And we were all pretty wrecked. And it just really hammered home the difference between playing it for a month and what happens when you have this dog that accompanies a PC for, I think it was 3 months, 4 months. And suddenly, here we are, this dog is older than it had any right to be. We don't know how it got that old. But, yeah, now the dog is dying. And it was... I shed a couple tears.
Yeah, I think this is the first time I've felt a tear welling in my eye recording the Gauntlet podcast.
It always has to be, if it's a loyal dog, yeah.
Yeah, but with that said, do either of you have any questions?
I don't have any questions. I just want to say how exciting and inspiring it is to me that you had this grand conception of a seemingly wild idea to run this game for a year and delivered on it. I just think it's awesome.
I honestly get weirded out when people say Powered by the Apocalypse games are only good for 4 sessions or so, because I feel most games have built-in narrative arcs that need several sessions. But it's really great to hear Passiones really having all this room to breathe and having all these different versions. I know that the final version of the game, when it comes out, is going to have all these different play sets, but it's great knowing that you can do so much with just the base set already before the final version of the game is out.
I can't wait to see what's going to be possible with the actual full release. If this is what I can do with the playtest documents, I can't wait to find out what I can do with the rest of it.
So exciting. And Brandon Leangambetta is such an amazing designer. I really can't wait to see what he and the team does. So, listeners, for our final segment of this podcast, we talk about what is giving us life. We each discuss something that is lately inspiring us or giving us joy. I'm going to start with Shane. Shane, what is giving you life nowadays?
Well, I have been preparing for my first time running Good Society, the Jane Austen role-playing game. I would love to tell you that I've been rereading Austen's work, but instead I have been re-watching the Jane Austen cinema canon, and that's what's been giving me life. You can just say, like, Colin Firth wet t-shirt scene, famous in the BBC adaptation, is what's giving me life, but also just want to mention Tom Wamsgans from Succession played Mr. Darcy in Pride and Prejudice, which shocked me because I really thought he was American. It turns out, just a good accent. My very favourite Jane Austen adaptation, of course, is Clueless with Alicia Silverstone, which updates Edit for the 90s. And I also want to mention Whit Stillman has a movie called Love and Friendship, which adapts an unfinished early Jane Austen novel and just makes it about like a really mean older woman who's a complete troll. And it's a joy. So that's what's been giving me life.
And Puckett, how about yourself?
Lately, it's been seeing what people can do with tarot decks in games. And there's a specific tarot deck that should be getting delivered from Kickstarter sometime soon, the Alleyman's Tarot. And if you don't know about this, it is wild. It is a tarot deck that, if I recall correctly, is 173 cards. If I remember correctly, some people are referring to it as a magpie deck. Every card in it is a card from another deck. And I'm just trying to think, I wonder what could I do with that deck in a game? What kind of mechanics could result from such a thing that would actually be useful even for people who don't have that deck? So that's kind of what's been giving me life lately, just looking at the possibilities of things like that.
Yeah, that's super awesome. Yeah, and for me, what's been giving me life? January was a really tough month for my bad brain stuff, so I've been rewatching comfort movies. So recently it's been things like Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which is so good. It is so excellent. And also the Transformers animated movie from the 80s, which is also even better than I remember. I got to see it in 4K recently. It's so good, among other movies I've been watching. But in particular, I have to give a shout out to Clash of the Titans from 1981. Unlike Who Framed Roger Rabbit and Transformers, it did not age as well.
Oh no, I loved this movie when I was a kid.
No, it's still, I mean, the effects are atrocious, but I still really enjoyed it. It was still really good. So it's one of those things where it looks better in your mind than when you actually watch it. But I got to watch it with Matthew, and it was Matthew, my partner's first time, and he had so much fun watching it. He kept saying the whole time, wow, this explains so much, your GMing style and how you design games. And I was like, what? But it's true. It's very true. Like, in Clash of the Titans, so many things happen. Like, it's like one thing after another. It's a true odyssey. There's just a way I tend to design games or run games that's reminiscent of what goes on in Clash of the Titans. I must have watched that movie on Betamax like over and over again as a child. I think I watched both Clash of the Titans and Transformers every day, right, for like a year at least when I was young. But yeah, so that's what's been giving me life. It's been really fun coming back to that. So yeah, folks, that is our show. And thank you so much for hanging out with us. And to everyone on the Gauntlet community, thank you so much for playing with us. You can check out the show notes for links about the games that we discuss down below. And you can find out more about the Gauntlet at www.gauntlet-rpg.com, where you can find articles, podcast info, and links to our forums. You can follow us on Twitter at GauntletRPG. And if you're interested in playing with the Gauntlet, please do join us. You can check out our forums or check out our Patreon at patreon.com/gauntlet. Remember, the hard part is spelling the Gauntlet right. I have to read this as part of the script. I just find that really funny, but I guess that's true, right? So please, it's GAUNTLET, right? So yeah, thank you so much, everybody. Once again, that is our show, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much, Shane. You are lovely, as always, for co-hosting with me.
Thank you.
And thank you, Puckett, for joining us. I can't wait for another year of Fashonas from you.
It'll probably be 2023 at this rate. Thank you for having me.